Indigenous Rights Radio, because knowledge is power.
Cultural Survival recognizes and supports the important work carried out by community radio stations and independent spaces in addressing various issues and keeping their communities informed. On this occasion, Cultural Survival acknowledges the role of Indigenous defenders worldwide, while also recognizing the ongoing challenges and constant dangers they face as a result of their important work in defending their territories. We had a chance to speak to 4 Indigenous defenders from different fields. We spoke to EMIL, a member of the South African hip-hop group Black Noise, uses his platform to raise awareness about environmental justice. We also spoke to Lucille, an advocate for reclaiming Indigenous heritage, has worked in the museum sector since 1998, and also spoke to Denver, an Indigenous rights activist, discusses the erasure of Indigenous identities and his journey of reclaiming his name and cultural heritage. And lastly, we also spoke to Uxoli, a young environmentalist and the founder of Black Girls Rising. Started her activism after noticing the environmental disparities in Cape Town.
For me, it was so important also to decolonize my name because, Denver was sort of a name that my mother gave me, but it was also given, at a time when we as queer people were forced to absolutely erase and forget who we were. And so late in my life, I sort of, and I think I sort of reclaimed myself, through the words of my ancestors. And so I gave myself the name Torocha. And Torocha in Khoekhoe means fighting spirit.
My full name was Xoliswa Vuyani. I was born and raised in Cape Town, Iguguletu to be specific. And I am an environmentalist and also the founder of Black Girls Rising.
I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, in the U.S. My wife and family are here, and so we had to return to the U.S. to help with a mom that's not doing too well. So that's why I'm here in the U.S.
I'm Lucy, and I call myself a heritage, heritage activist. What that means is that I believe that once you know who you are, then you're already in the process of identifying yourself as, I won't say Indigenous, but as a person that acknowledges who they are and where they come from and what is their culture. I started working in museums, I think, 1998. But even before that, I worked in organizations like the trade union movement. So I got a lot of my consciousness from working class, working with working class on the shop floor, working with bread and butter issues. We'll always say people before profits. So I come in from that kind of angle into the museum in 1998.
There's something about the name, that also just reminds me that I come from a first origin Indigenous people of the land because, Denver, as a name absolutely means nothing in the context of South Africa and Africa. So I think everything we talk about, Indigenous people defending, I literally was having to stand up against, this name that, that's actually just spoke to the erasure, the kakapusa of our people. So Torocha. But you can also call me Denver, because, but Torocha again, it's a name that I just feel, connects me to the land and also makes me part of this land.
For me, it started in high school. I was privileged enough to go to a multiracial school, which was outside my community. And so the commutes in the morning really opened my eyes on the disparities that existed in Cape Town. So driving from Iguguletu to Edown, and often you would know if you're driving on N2, the first thing you see is the informal settlements. But then as you get closer to the city, you get to see the prestigious, Table Mountain, the open land. And I think that raised a lot of questions. And I started asking, my teachers of why the differences. And through that, I then became interested in looking into our environmental spaces, but especially like access, what people have access to. And when I went back to my community, I started seeing like there was no access to green spaces, there were no trees, there were no recycling resources. And the more I asked those questions, and then I realized that it was not a priority, from the city's perspectives to green townships. And then I took it upon myself, I guess, to raise that awareness and to start, small, starting with school, like starting eco clubs and just raising awareness and empowering kids to plant trees, to look after the environment. And then that just grew, my activism and just me really just raising awareness about what was happening in marginalized communities versus affluent areas. And then that then brought in other global issues, like the climate change, even other like social and environmental issues that exist.
From the very start, when we started writing with Black Noise, one of the first songs that we wrote was about, it was actually called The Day After. And it was actually in reference to a day after things go terribly wrong on the planet with the environmental issues, with climate change. And this is this was like the late 80s, yet we wrote the song. And the more we went and, performed the song in different communities. I mean, we were probably one of the first rap groups to win a City of Cape Town award on Arbor Day for performing that song, and then the song made it to #1 on Metro FM in Joburg when we released the album. I'll actually send you a copy of the song so you can check it out. But it sort of inspired a lot of conversation around, the not only the environment but also our role on the planet.
So for me, being in the heritage sector was amazing, that I could actually find myself, but I could also fight with this knowledge of who I am. Nobody could tell me who I am. And even up to today, I will never allow anybody to tell me who I am. So for me, as a heritage, I don't know, you call it a defender, so many things come to mind, Kusi, with regards to indigenous. Because there are many of us in this country, and I think in many other countries, that don't really know what it really means, indigenous, because many of us have never been seen as indigenous. Especially, I would think more of Cape Town, and I think of South Africa, but I think mostly of Cape Town, that we never identified ourselves as indigenous. And suddenly, now we are indigenous, and we're starting to wear the indigenous clothes, and we're starting to represent actually an indigenous person that is not really well known, because the history of indigenous has very much been in the dark.
We kind of grow up as, in this colonially created colored identity, and it's very much similar to how in the US, you have this Latino identity. And so people are also challenging the Latino identity because, like the term colored, it was really just forced upon us by colonizers. And to them, identity meant, that now there was nobody that can remind them about how they became, such massive landowners. And so you really just get into this work because you recognize that there was an injustice in that, because 300 years ago, the people that my mother belonged to in Grafrenet, we would have never called ourselves colored. What does it mean? What does it mean to call yourself colored?
It's such an interesting concept. And I think especially from the South African perspective, because we don't use the word indigenous defenders, Tina. We speak a lot about frontline communities. And I think probably it goes back to the colonialization, which I won't go to. But I mean, going back to your question, it's really just people that have ancestral rights to their land, and people that live very closely to the environment. They protect their diversities. They advocate for their cultural heritage. I mean, they stand for the preservation of the ecosystems and the rights of their communities. And they resist like harmful activities like mining, deforestation, oil extractions, and they defend, I mean, both the land, but also like the global future of their own environments.
These are, people, again, like I said, that have a connection to the land and see themselves as being owned by the land. And so I say this out loud because it's a concept that Western communities really can't wrap their head around.
Firstly, with regard to defending your lands, is to understand, why are you defending this land? You need to understand about the land. You need to understand, why is it that we have to pay rent? You have to understand, why is it that when we have to leave the mother's home, we don't have a piece of land to go to? There are so many, it gets very complex, indigenous.
I mean, it ranged from like physical violence to assassination to legal prostitution to displacement. And I'll make an example with like Ilalik Kolobin, which probably a lot of people from the Eastern Cape will be familiar with. There was a big corporation who wanted to mine in that village. And the people, the community frontliners or defenders, they stood up against that corporation and they fought them and like opposing the extraction, that was going to happen in their land. And so it's and from that, I mean, there was I mean, violence. And unfortunately, I mean, fortunately for this, in that case, there was no assassination, but we've seen a lot of like activism being assassinated. I mean, I forgot the Umama was a KZN who was also fighting to protect their land, and was killed, and I think often some of them, they have to flee their land for protection, leaving everything behind and going to literally like to nowhere. And I mean, this is not just local, but also globally, like regions like the Amazon, we see the highest rate of violence. I mean, the environmental defenders are continuously being killed, just in the name of protecting what is theirs.
There's a ridiculous amount of activity that's taking place. I mean, after you sent me the information, I just went to personally also go and do research, and it's something like 281 defenders that were killed in 25 countries in like the last couple of years, in the last 10 years.
You see, one example I can make, Kusi, is the Lispik Parkway. That is quite a controversial topic, that and that the indigenous people, I mean, or the people or the defenders of indigenous people face problems because the West does not want us to be indigenous. They don't want us to go back to the land because the land has to be developed. According to them, the land, there has to be a building, there has to be a place where people can go to and pay. It is quite controversial. It is not what what we call the capitalist democracy. It is a kind of very much opposite because of what capitalism has done. In the first place, if you look at the area of the Lispik River, for instance, and you look at that whole area, that was an area where our indigenous pastured their animals, where they grew their indigenous medicines, where they grazed the cattle, where they lived, where they loved, so now that has become a mall. It is very simple to understand how, people that are natural have to defend the naturalness of who we are. If you think of Cape Town, you think of the white lion, for instance, that roamed, these areas. If you think of the people that lived here, of the land, of the sea, you don't see those people there anymore.
There's I think, we bombarded with what is negative and what is what is the losses. But there are, everywhere that these voices are being heard, there are changes taking place, that people are insisting that whether it be the communities of the Amazon insisting and standing up and fighting to maintain the spaces that they have.
You see, there's also the issue of Palestine. I haven't even gotten to that, But with regards to, that's what makes it so difficult for us, Kusi, to speak out and to raise our voices, but to speak to our people. Because our people are saying to us, but we don't believe you. Because our history starts at 1652. You see, so for us, a lot of our people, and I'm saying globally, the people in New Zealand and Australia, they are still fighting for their human rights. There are still things like reserves. Our people are still living in reserves, we are still living in quarters, in segregated quarters. And you find that the commonalities between the people in all over the world, globally, the indigenous people, they face the same legacies. We are facing the same legacies that the people in Canada, Australia, and those people. And those legacies is one of it is poverty. The other one of it is crime. The other one of it is teenage pregnancies. We have a lot of teenage pregnancies and alcohol and addictions and crime. It is high on the populations of so-called indigenous peoples all over the world. They're facing the same issues.
Again, coming back to say, this work for me is about healing, Purusen in self-healing, and there's something about finding myself in an African identity, finding myself in a language and a culture, and, and bringing me a sense of peace. And I think South Africa lacks peace because there's all these, to the heart of this land, and I often just say, the heart of this land was Khoi Khoi, the Pau means heart, the soul of this land. And, so and it's like when you hurt the mother, you hurt the family. And so this mother was hurt, which is a Khoi Khoi woman. And so for us to heal this land, we have to be part of the healing of our Khoi woman. And I think that for me is so important that, we recognize that, if we heal what was taken away and what hurt
I mean, now, yes, there's been a lot of acknowledgement in terms of why they are important in the movement. But I think the more we really prioritize and give them the seat at the table, especially around policy development and frameworks, the more their voices will be heard and their lands will be protected.
First and foremost, think of yourself as an indigenous defender. Like this, you're indigenous to this planet. You have to get involved to bring about change. It is, when we wrote The Day After, we didn't think that it will manifest in our lifetimes. We are seeing this planet in its final hour almost because of what we are facing. And if we don't shift our thinking, things are only going to get worse for as far as the environment on this planet is concerned. And these companies are a minority. The people are the majority. We have power to change it if we work collectively.
They can get a hold of me on 084 88 32 514 or on my email lucelle@gmail.com. And then we are also on Facebook. Find me on Transcending History Tours. Come book a tour so that you can know what it means to be indigenous. So we are spreading. And also I'm also working in the queer rights organizations called Triangle. I'm working with them also with regards to indigenous. So you see how intersectional, indigenous defenders work becomes.
I think, I always say to the girls that we work with is that if we are not active citizens and we are not curious about what is happening in the world, we're gonna find ourselves being enslaved in our own traditional ways of being. And I think it's time to take back our power to really go back to our roots, to learn, to be proud of who we are. I mean, these concepts are not new. I mean, if you go to Mtohlale's Lalini, that is for me, an indigenous defender, because that person lives, they're sustainable. Everything they use is centered around them caring for their land. And if we can go back to that and teach our kids, to value those things, we could really live in a more sustainable and just world.
Indigenous Rights Radio, because knowledge is power.